the roadside abduction. I had just finished a long day of meetings and was driving home from Denver to my small rural house in the foothills of the Rockies. I usually made a stop at the gas station on Highway 285, the one with the old wooden sign and that oddly comforting smell of fresh coffee and diesel fuel. It's a pit stop that had become part of my routine, where I'd stretch my legs and grab a snack before heading back to the quiet of my country home. On this chilly October evening, I was looking forward to getting back and unwinding with a hot cup of cocoa. Little did I know, tonight would be different. As I was filling up my tank, I noticed a man lingering by the edge of the lot. His car, a dusty, beaten-up sedan, parked a few spaces away. He seemed to be watching me intently, though he wasn't overtly menacing. I shrugged it off, thinking he was just another passerby or perhaps someone waiting for a ride. As I went inside to pay, I saw him step closer to the store, his gaze never wavering. The clerk, an elderly woman named Betty, gave me a nod, but her usual cheery demeanor seemed a bit off tonight. When I came out of the store, the man was now standing right by my car, examining it in a way that made me uneasy. He looked up as I approached and quickly averted his eyes. I tried to ignore it, but his presence felt invasive. I started my engine, and as I pulled out of the station, I noticed him getting back into his car, almost as if he was following me. My heartbeat quickened, but I told myself it was just paranoia. The man's car kept appearing in my rearview mirror, maintaining a steady distance but never breaking away. It wasn't until I turned off the highway onto a less-traveled country road that his car seemed to close the gap. The road was winding and isolated, with thick woods on either side. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that this was just a coincidence, or maybe even a fellow traveler. Yet the longer I drove, the more the sense of dread grew. Eventually, I reached a part of the road where the trees closed in tighter, and my headlights barely pierced the darkness. Suddenly, the man's car flashed its high beams at me, blinding me momentarily. When I could see again, his car was right on my tail. Panicked, I decided to speed up, trying to lose him in the maze of turns and dips. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to risk stopping, but I needed to figure out a way to shake him off. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, I noticed a dilapidated farmhouse off the road. My heart sank as I saw the man's car pull into the driveway of the house, which looked abandoned. I had no choice but to continue driving, but the sight of that isolated place filled me with terror. What if he was waiting for me to pull in? What if this was some sort of trap? Desperate to escape, I pulled off onto a small gravel road leading to an old logging trail I knew. The road was rough and bumpy, but it was my only option. I parked my car behind a cluster of trees and turned off my engine, trying to steady my breathing. Through the trees, I could see the man's headlights approaching. He must have followed me onto the trail. I needed to stay hidden and hope he wouldn't find me. Minutes felt like hours as I waited in the darkness, listening to the distant hum of the man's engine. I could hear him outside, walking around, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. Then, to my horror, I saw a flash of light through the trees. The man was using a flashlight, scanning the area. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't notice me. His voice, though muffled, was clearly agitated, and I could make out fragments of his angry mutterings. After what felt like an eternity, the man's footsteps grew fainter, and I dared to peek out. He was walking back towards the farmhouse, leaving me alone. With trembling hands, I started my car and carefully drove back to the highway, keeping a vigilant eye for any signs of his return. I knew I had to get to safety, and fast. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. Back on the highway, I breathed a sigh of relief as I saw familiar lights of the town ahead. But the sense of relief was short-lived. I realized the man's car was still in the vicinity. His headlights flashed in my rearview mirror once more. It was as if he had never left. The feeling of being hunted, of someone knowing my every move, was overwhelming. I had to find a way to end this chase. I made a decision to drive to the nearest police station, hoping they could help. As I pulled up to the station, I saw the man's car parked outside. My heart pounded as I rushed inside and explained the situation. The officers took my statement and went outside to investigate. They returned with a chilling revelation. The man was a known criminal with a history of stalking and abductions. The police were able to apprehend him, but the whole ordeal left me shaken. They informed me that the farmhouse was indeed abandoned but had been a site of previous criminal activity. I went home that night, but the sense of being followed never fully left me. The roadside abduction had been a grim reminder of how quickly a routine night could turn into a nightmare. The shadows on the farm. My name is Jessica, and I've always lived in the heart of the city, Chicago. The hustle and bustle of urban life were my norm until last summer, when I decided to take a break from it all. I wanted to reconnect with nature, so I rented a small farmhouse in rural Wisconsin, just outside of a town called Prairie View. The place seemed perfect, serene, isolated, and surrounded by endless fields. It was the kind of escape I thought would rejuvenate me. The house was old but charming, with a wraparound porch and tall oak trees casting long shadows in the evening light. I looked forward to my quiet retreat, completely unaware that my new beginning would turn into something far more unsettling. The first few days at the farmhouse were blissful. I spent my mornings hiking through the nearby woods and evenings watching the sun set over the horizon. However, a creeping unease began to settle in on the fourth night. It started with small noises, a creak from the attic, the snap of a twig outside my window. I tried to brush it off as the quirks of an old house and the sounds of the countryside, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, convinced it was just my overactive imagination. Still, the unease grew, punctuated by the occasional, inexplicable scratching sound on the outside walls. One afternoon, as I was exploring the overgrown field behind the house, I stumbled upon a dilapidated shed I hadn't noticed before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a look inside. The interior was dark and musty, with old farming tools and boxes covered in dust. In the corner, half buried under some tarps, I found a stack of old photographs. They were black and white images of people I didn't recognize, standing in front of this very farmhouse. The most unsettling part was a single photograph showing a man standing directly in front of the shed, holding a grim expression. The feeling of being watched intensified as I studied the photo, making me eager to return to the safety of the house. The next night, I heard a loud thud coming from the direction of the shed. My heart raced as I cautiously approached with a flashlight. The shed door was ajar, and when I peeked inside, the stack of photographs was gone. Panic surged through me as I realized someone else had been in the shed, someone who knew I had discovered the photos. I quickly locked the shed and returned to the house, my mind racing with fear. Every little sound outside seemed amplified, and sleep became elusive. I kept imagining shadows moving just beyond my window, adding to my growing paranoia. By the end of the week, I was on edge and decided to visit the local diner in Prairie View to ease my nerves. I struck up a conversation with the waitress, Linda, who seemed friendly enough. When I mentioned the odd occurrences at the farmhouse, her demeanor shifted. She hesitated before telling me that the house had a history of strange events and that previous tenants had complained about similar disturbances. Linda mentioned a local family known for their peculiar behavior, suggesting they might be involved. Her words only heightened my anxiety, making me question whether I should cut my stay short and head back to the city. Later that day, while driving back to the farmhouse, I noticed a rusty old truck parked by the roadside near the property. A man with a weathered face and a worn hat was leaning against it, watching me intently. When I tried to make eye contact, he quickly turned away and got into the truck, driving off with a cloud of dust. The encounter left me feeling more unsettled than ever. That night, the scratching sound on the walls became louder and more persistent. I could hear faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, adding to the growing sense of dread. Determined to confront my fears, I stayed in the house that night with all the lights on. The scratching on the walls grew louder and more erratic, and I could hear footsteps moving around outside. I tried to calm myself by telling myself it was just my imagination, but every creak and rustle made my heart pound harder. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. My flashlight flickered and then died, leaving me alone in the pitch-black house with only the sounds of my own breathing and the disturbing noises outside. As the darkness enveloped the house, I heard a loud banging on the front door. With trembling hands, I grabbed a baseball bat I'd found in the shed and cautiously approached the door. The banging continued, relentless and forceful. I mustered all my courage and flung open the door, only to find the night air filled with silence and shadows. There was no one in sight, but the sense of foreboding remained. I was about to close the door when I noticed a small, handwritten note lying on the doorstep. It read, "Leave now before it's too late." Panic set in as I read the note. I packed a few essentials and decided to leave the farmhouse immediately. I drove through the darkened countryside, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. As I approached the main road, I saw the same rusty truck from earlier parked by the side of the road, its engine idling. My heart pounded as I sped past, trying not to look back. The feeling of being followed lingered, making every shadow seem like a threat. I drove straight to the nearest hotel, determined to stay somewhere safe. The next morning, I contacted the local police to report the strange occurrences at the farmhouse. To my shock, the officer who responded seemed eerily familiar with the case. He mentioned that the farmhouse had been the center of several ongoing investigations, and that no one had been able to uncover the truth about the disturbances. The officer's nonchalant attitude made me question whether there was more to the story than I had been told. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being covered up or that I was part of a larger, more sinister plot. I left Wisconsin and returned to Chicago, but the sense of dread never fully dissipated. I kept thinking about the farmhouse and the unsettling encounters I had faced. The feeling of being watched and the strange occurrences haunted my dreams, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. I never discovered who or what was behind the disturbances, but the experience left me with a lingering sense of unease. The rural escape I had sought turned into a chilling reminder of the unknown dangers that can lie hidden in the most seemingly peaceful places. The farmhouse at the end of the road. I'm Julia, a 29-year-old graphic designer living in Denver, Colorado. On weekends, I often take road trips to unwind and explore rural areas away from the city hustle. This past August, a chance to escape the daily grind led me to a seemingly idyllic farm stay about an hour outside of town. The farmhouse, perched at the end of a long dirt road, looked perfect from the pictures, quaint, rustic, and secluded. The owner, a friendly elderly woman named Ruth, greeted me warmly and showed me to my room. Everything felt comfortable and familiar, like a scene from a cozy movie. However, as the sun began to set, I couldn't shake off a creeping sense of unease that had settled in. The first night went smoothly. I enjoyed a quiet dinner, cooked in the farmhouse's charming kitchen, and spent some time on the porch enjoying the tranquil sounds of the countryside. Ruth had mentioned that the farm had been in her family for generations and spoke fondly of its history. It was only later, as I was preparing for bed, that I noticed something odd. The shutters on the windows were unusually heavy, and the door to my room didn't close completely, leaving a small gap. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the house's age and rustic charm. However, as darkness enveloped the house, I couldn't ignore the growing sensation that I wasn't alone. At around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud thump coming from downstairs. My heart raced as I lay still, listening for any signs of movement. The house seemed eerily quiet once more, but the unsettling sound had left me on edge. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but the sense of foreboding was hard to shake. I lay in bed, staring at the sliver of light coming through the gap in the door, trying to ignore the chill that crept over me. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I managed to fall back asleep, though it was fitful and restless. The following morning, Ruth seemed oblivious to the noise I had heard. She cheerfully offered me breakfast and made small talk about the farm's activities. I tried to bring up the noise, but she brushed it off with a vague excuse about the old house being prone to creaks and groans. Despite her reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After breakfast, I decided to explore the property a bit more, hoping that a little daylight might alleviate my unease. The sprawling fields and rustic barns were picturesque, but the sense of being watched persisted. As I wandered around the farm, I noticed a small shed at the edge of the property that had been partially obscured by overgrown bushes. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pushed through the tangled branches and approached it. The shed was old and decrepit, with a rusty padlock on the door. I felt a strange compulsion to open it, but my rational mind told me to stay away. As I was about to turn back, I noticed something unsettling, a faint, fresh footprint in the mud near the shed's entrance. I quickly walked back to the farmhouse, my nerves on edge. Back at the house, I found Ruth in the living room, and her demeanor seemed different. She was more reserved and less chatty than before. I asked if she knew anything about the shed and its condition, but she seemed evasive, mumbling something about it being a long-forgotten storage space. I felt a growing sense of dread and decided to call my friend back in Denver for some comfort. During the call, I heard a strange noise coming from somewhere within the house, soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone was trying to get my attention. As the day wore on, the unease intensified. Ruth had suggested I take a walk around the property in the afternoon, but I declined, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Instead, I opted to stay inside and read, hoping to distract myself. However, the tapping noise continued intermittently, growing louder and more persistent. I began to feel like I was being watched, and every creak of the old house seemed amplified in my heightened state of anxiety. When evening fell, I decided to investigate the source of the tapping noise. Armed with a flashlight, I followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from the attic. The attic door was tucked away at the end of a long, narrow hallway. My heart pounded as I climbed the creaky stairs and hesitated before pushing open the heavy door. Inside, the attic was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the space was cluttered with old furniture and dusty boxes. In the corner of the attic, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A small, dusty journal lying on an old trunk. It looked ancient, with a leather cover cracked with age. As I picked it up, I felt a chill run down my spine. The pages were filled with strange, cryptic entries, some of which described disturbing occurrences and unsettling observations about the farm. One entry, in particular, mentioned someone watching from the shadows and hinted at a dark secret hidden on the property. My pulse raced as I realized the implications of what I had found. The journal's final entries were even more alarming, detailing a growing sense of paranoia and fear from the writer. The last entry was abruptly cut off, leaving a chilling sense of unfinished business. As I tried to make sense of it all, I heard footsteps coming from the stairs. I quickly closed the journal and turned off the flashlight, trying to remain hidden. Ruth's voice echoed through the attic, calling out for me. I managed to hide behind a stack of old trunks as Ruth entered the attic. She seemed to be searching for something and moved with a determined urgency. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible. After what felt like an eternity, Ruth left, closing the attic door behind her. I waited in the darkness, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The journal had clearly revealed that something sinister was happening, but I had no idea what to do next. As I carefully descended the attic stairs, I saw Ruth in the kitchen, her demeanor calm and almost too calm. She was preparing dinner, but her movements were mechanical, devoid of the warmth she had shown earlier. I decided it was time to leave, no matter how late it was. I quickly packed my things and prepared to make a run for it. As I was about to leave, I noticed Ruth standing in the hallway, her eyes fixed on me with an unreadable expression. I managed to escape the farmhouse, my heart pounding with adrenaline. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the farmhouse receding into the distance. The unease I felt never fully dissipated, and I later learned that Ruth had a history of troubling behavior that was known to some locals but not widely publicized. The farmhouse at the end of the road remains a haunting memory, a reminder that some rural getaways are better left unexplored.